which biome chest weapon in Terraria is the best one. In this video, I'll be comparing them against some bosses and damage per second tests and then saying the results at the end. But you guys feel free to comment down below your opinions and what you think should have been higher on the list or lower. Starting out the vampire knives, these are definitely the most popular, as they heal you, do tons of damage, and are melee class. Though just know for these testing, I had solar flare armor on, no other damage accessories, so I did do extra damage for melee class, so take the initial damage per second of the melee weapons with a grain of salt. Starting out, the vampire knives were doing 1100 damage, though of course this was normally less. This was really good for single target, as they don't pierce anything. Some of the other weapons will show multi-targets on. But, of course, the main quirk of the vampire knives is actually that they heal you when dealing damage, but against a target dummy, it does not show that. So you'll be able to see those later on in some boss fights in the video. Next is the piranha gun, which is a very unique weapon, as you basically latch the piranhas onto the target dummy and then hold down the attack button and they deal damage. Here, after messing up shooting them, I only get 2 of them armed, which gives about 400 damage per second. You can get more than this by getting 3 piranhas latched on, as it shoots 3 of them, though I did miss for this part of the damage testing. I've done a separate video on this, which will be linked on the top right screen right now. And this weapon's actually really good, considering it's a ranged weapon that doesn't do a ton of damage and comes after Plantera. It can do really good against Golem, as you'll see later on in this video. A fun fact about all these weapons is they're actually post-Plantera. While you can get biome keys before Plantera, ever since 1.3.0.1, you cannot actually open the biome chest until defeating Plantera, which is probably fair, as getting these weapons pre-mech would be insane. Moving on to the rainbow gun, this weapon's also a pretty unique one, as you shoot out the rainbow and it stays there. It's a mage weapon, and you don't even have to be holding the weapon. And as you can see, single target, it's really bad, 300 damage per second. But that's not this weapon's buff. This weapon has infinite piercing, so on multi-target, it does insane damage, and this is without any armor or damage buffing accessories. It goes over 6,000 damage per second. And keep in mind, I'm not doing anything right now. No player inputs, this is just pure damage from the rainbow gun. This weapon's definitely one of the best support weapons in the game. As many others, you have to at least be doing something. And unlike the piranha gun earlier, you don't have to actually be attacking, as with the piranha gun you had to hold it down, so you couldn't use other items while using the piranha gun. The main problem of this weapon is the rainbows disappear every once in a while, so you do have to reapply them, though this is a great support weapon just to have in your hotbar so you can put it out and use your main damage, even if you're using any other class. Moving on to the Scourge of the Corruptor, this is one that I feel is often overlooked, as here it does not do great damage, but that's because the attack, once you hit an enemy, it breaks into a bunch of smaller projectiles, up to 15, very rarely. But these actually home on enemies. Right here, they aren't doing any damage. I tested them, for some reason they won't hit target dummies. But later against the bosses, you'll see how powerful this weapon can really be. And the biggest problem for this weapon, honestly, is the fact that you can't get the vampire knives and this weapon on the same world. But as I'll mention later, you can just make a new world that's Crimson. Next is the Staff of Frost Hydra, which does okay damage. It's a sentry. As you can see, it does about 115 damage, up to 120, as you can see there, but it's not great. Though this is excluding the 25 damage per second, 10 per tick of Frostbite debuff, not Frostburn. If it had that, it would probably be a better weapon. So it's definitely a little better than this, but not great. But what can you expect from a sentry, as most all of sentries in the game are bought from the Tavern Keep NPC. This is one of the few that are not. Other than that, there's not much about this weapon that's really special, so we'll move on to the Desert Tiger Staff, which is a summon that does more damage the more of them you have summoned, and can go up to 9. Though you cannot have multiple summoned, it just upgrades doing more damage, up to 9 summons, and then it maxes out. Overall, it's okay. Here I don't have it maxed out. For some of the boss fights later I will, and it does about 200 damage per second. Nothing too special for a summon, though it does have a burst attack which lasts longer the higher upgrade it is, which does a ton of damage, and that's really where the damage per second goes up. Otherwise, it's really bad. The next section of this video will be boss fights with all of these weapons. We'll start out with mech fights, all 3 at once with each weapon, move into Golem, and then at the end we'll have a final ranking on a tier list and my final thoughts on all of these weapons. First is the Piranha Gun, which really needs something else there as support, as it's not a great damage weapon. You need something like a summon and actual armor and accessories. As for these fights, I only had movement accessories, and my only armor was Vortex, Stardust, and the respective armor for each class of these weapons. And a major problem during this fight was it seemed whenever the destroyer went off screen, the piranhas would despawn. So I kept having to shoot them out again, and they're really janky to aim as they have pretty random accuracy. But after a while, I was able to take out the destroyer, which is definitely the worst boss for these. As for the twins, it actually did really well. Of course, this is post-Plantera, so you wouldn't realistically be doing this fight. And then for destroyer, I was able to just focus the head, ignoring the arms. Next, the Rainbow Gun. This weapon is not meant to be a main weapon, and it shows in this fight, as it just did not do good as a main weapon. This would be a great support with any one of these other weapons against the mechs. And it did do pretty good taking out Skeletron's arms, and surprisingly took Spasmatism out pretty quickly. It was okay against Destroyer once again, being able to pierce through, but right here I got lucky. A bunch of the bosses lined up with one segment of it. So I was able to take out Spaz and Destroyer. And then started focusing Retinas, but decided to go for Skeletron, as it's a slower moving target, so I was able to bait it into the rainbow easier than Retinas, which was flying all around and a pain to get into it. Right here, I hit a teleporter, which I have painted invisible, and this part took forever trying to defeat Retinas, trying to force it in. Next are Vampire Knives, which the beginning of the fight's kind of unfair, as I have the Nebula's armor's buffs, as I just switched to Solar Flare, but that goes away pretty quickly. And these weapons are amazing. The biggest downside was actually the fact that when hitting bosses like the Destroyer, the healing effect that's red of the Vampire Knives looked just like lasers, so I kept trying to dodge them before I finally realized that's healing me, not hurting me. So it did pretty good against Spaz, as most of these weapons so far actually have. Against Destroyer, there are better weapons out there, just go for something like the Daedalus Storm Bow, but it definitely did okay, being able to hit multiple segments of it at once and having pretty good accuracy for Destroyer. Against the other bosses, the accuracy wasn't great though. And this fight took quite a while, as another problem is for melee you really need some accessories, as there are some really good ones like the Fire Gauntlet and Celestial Stone, but I don't have any accessories here, only Solar Flare armor. So it definitely did struggle. Eventually I took out the twins, started focusing Skeletron Prime, and was able to take the arms out pretty easily, and then took out Destroyer, which was really just annoying, as I had to just keep shooting it, and the attacks wouldn't do much damage, plus I had God Mode on for this fight, just because I don't have accessories. Next, going into Scourge of the Corruptor, which is basically the opposite of Vampire Knives. It's corruption. Okay, that's really the only way it is, but it's also pretty accurate, which the Vampire Knives struggled with, as they disappeared after I threw it for a certain distance. The best part of the Scourge of the Corruptor is when you hit an enemy, it splits into a bunch of small ones, as I explained earlier, which have homing attacks. So that did most of my damage. Plus, we're able to take out the probes really easily, something the Vampire Knives struggled with a lot. And this was probably one of the funnest fights, as this weapon's just pretty accurate, and it was a pretty good weapon for this fight. So if you're for some reason refighting mechs and have all these weapons, I'd recommend the Scourge of the Corruptor so far. We have 2 left, so we all have to watch those as well, plus Golem fight. Speeding up the footage, I finished the fight, and it was about half the time of the Vampire Knives, though if this was an actual fight, I'd be taking a lot more damage since it doesn't heal me at all. Next, these weapons are definitely not meant for a solo boss fight, as summons definitely need a whip, for the Desert Tiger Staff, and sentries, they're not meant to be used on their own. There's a reason that there aren't a ton of playthroughs using sentry only, and why that's considered a pretty hard challenge. First is the Staff of Frost Hydra, which this is not meant to be used on its own. I used some armor from the Tavern Keep so I could spawn 4 of them, and I just sat there while I went and did something else and left the game running. And I wouldn't say these did awful considering their staffs, but it was also able to tank it, and my armor definitely did some damage to these bosses. And most of the damage to the bosses from the Frost Hydra staff, I would say, is probably from the Frostbite debuff, as it was doing 25 damage per second to them. While the actual damage from these weren't amazing, I was getting up to 3,000 damage per second. Some of that was probably my Thorns potion as well. But surprisingly, this fight ended up being one of the fastest out of all the Biome chest weapons, probably because I was just sitting there, rather than trying to dodge attacks, even though I had God mode on the others, as I want these to simulate a pretty realistic fight, other than accessories. Next is the Desert Tiger Staff, which you really need a whip for summons, as I said a minute ago, as this just did not do good on its own. Once again, I just left the game running, and it did do pretty good, especially doing a lot of damage once it went into a second phase attack, where it just teleported around basically, hitting all the enemies, so it did really good during that phase. Other than that, it was mostly me sitting there once again. I would not recommend this for you to fight max with just one summon, but it did do decent damage, and once again was one of the fastest fights of the Biome weapons. And the next segment is Golem fights, as that's a boss you would realistically fight right after Plantera, as it's the next one. Starting out with the Vampire Knives, it did really well, being able to hit all of the arms and the core. The problem is, you don't actually have to defeat the arms, all you have to do is hit the core, but it was able to tank it if I didn't have God mode on. This is one of the most popular melee weapons for fighting Golem, and I can see why, as it did pretty good and can heal, because Golem sometimes can hit like a truck. But this is not the fastest fight for Golem. If you want to see that, keep watching. So I was able to take it out. I got the arms pretty easily and then hit the core. Once the arms are out of the way, I was able to do a lot more damage to the core as they weren't blocking the knives. But the spread was pretty inconsistent and I kept missing. Next, the Scourge of the Corruptor. This actually did amazing, as I love the accuracy of this weapon, and then, since it was confined space, the small projectiles that home did really well, as they almost never missed. Other than that, it's a Golem fight, using a kind of niche weapon that many people don't farm for, and it makes sense, as something like the Vampire Knives has really good utility, even as a support weapon to heal you if you're using any other class or any other melee weapon, like the Terror Blade. Next is the Piranha Gun, which I mentioned earlier is really good for Golem, and I showed that off in another video where I was maxing it out. So I started the fight, and the great part about this is you can pretty much ignore the arms and focus on dodging, as the piranhas you can make only hit the core, and once it changes phases, they don't even despawn. So you can pretty much sit here dodging the attacks while your piranhas do all the damage. This actually ended up being the fastest Golem fight out of all these weapons, which sort of surprised me. I knew this weapon was good, but I didn't think it would be faster than some of these other weapons on the list. Next is the Rainbow Gun, which, once again, it's a support weapon. This is not meant as a damage dealer, but it didn't do too bad, considering it was able to pierce through the arms and core. I would recommend using this with something like the Piranha Gun to do even more damage as a main weapon, though it didn't do too bad, definitely doing a lot better in this fight than it did against the mechs. And this fight ended up being the longest Golem fight out of all of them, which really makes sense as this is a support weapon, not meant as a main damage dealer, though it does surprise me considering it's able to take out a boss like Golem that does have a pretty good amount of health. Next is the Desert Tiger Staff, which did surprise me on this boss, considering it's a summon, and I finally figured out how to make it so the summon is a higher level, and it excelled against this boss, using its dash attack to go through the arms, and the core of Golem being able to easily defeat it, considering it's just one summon and there's no whip to help with damage. And the armor, of course, is just Stardust armor. And much of the damage did come from the special effect of the Desert Tiger. The problem was it kept getting stuck on the platforms during that second attack, which pretty much wasted much of its DPS, since all of its attack pretty much comes from that. The rest of the damage isn't all that much. And for the final Golem fight, before I show my final thoughts, is the longest one by far. Though, through the power of editing, I can speed it up. Plus, it was also pretty boring. And of course, this is the Frost Hydra Staff one. Eventually, I put them down at the bottom, and you should never use sentries as your main damage. They're meant as a backup weapon, mostly just for support, and of course, the boss fight took quite a while. In this next segment, I will be explaining my final thoughts on these and putting them in a tier list. And of course, if you disagree with these, put your ideas for the weapons and what the tier list should have been in the comments down below, and I'll be sure to read them. So I finished up the fight with the Frost Hydra Staff. The background footage for the tier list part is a Moonlord fight with the Biome chest weapons. So the bottom tier is useless, which is pretty self-explanatory because it's pretty much a useless weapon. I would never use it in an actual playthrough and only for this video. Next is, I probably wouldn't use it even if I have the key, which isn't useless, but even if I happen to get the key through luck, I would open the chest but probably never actually use the weapon, as it's just not good compared to other weapons at the same stage of the game. Middle tier is, I would use if I got the key and I'm using the same weapon class, which is another one where pretty easy to understand. It's a weapon that just isn't worth farming for, but if I get lucky and get the key and using that weapon specific class, I would still probably use it. The second best tier is worth farming for, which is another very self-explanatory tier, which it's not a great weapon, not the best, I'm not always going to get it, but it's definitely worth farming for to get the key, as the weapon is still really good. And the final and best tier is I always useless, which is a weapon that I would farm for in every playthrough, even if I'm using a different class, as it's just that great of a weapon. And now into the actual weapon rankings. Starting all the way down in useless is the Desert Tiger Staff, which is pretty obvious why. There are just so many better summons at the same stage of the game that are also easier to get that it just makes this weapon pretty obsolete, and even maxed out with 9 summons, it can't even get close to a weapon like the Terra Prisma, which can give you the highest summoner damage in the game, pre-mech if you're good enough to fight daytime Empress of Light. But even if you wait until after Golem, it's still easier to learn the attack patterns or to cheese Empress of Light daytime than farming in the desert biome for like an hour to get this summon. Next, and you probably wouldn't use even with the key, is the Staff of Frost Hydra, which is just worse than any other staff like Flame Burst or Ballistas, which you can get by just purchasing rather than farming the ice biome, again for like an hour to get. Plus, when fighting tier 3 Old One's army, you can get drops from the Betsy boss, which has some amazing weapons. And if you want to see a video on me showing off every Betsy weapon, click the link on the top right. Back to the video, it's much easier to fight Old One's army than farming in the ice biome, plus it's just easier and can be cheesed by using Hoiks to block the enemies. Moving up the tier list, in the would use if I got the key and I'm using its class, is the Piranha Gun, which is a decent weapon and good for some boss cheeses, and actually made a video maxing it out, which you guys can go watch, it's linked on the top right. But back to the video, it can be good with a summon as support because you don't have to aim it and it does constant damage, but it's not worth specifically farming for since the hard mode jungle is so difficult and they're just better ranger weapons out there. The one upside about farming for this, if you do decide to, is you can get it while you're mining chlorophyte, collecting life fruit, or searching for a Plantera bulb in the jungle. In the it's worth farming for tier, we have 2 different weapons, the Scourge of Corruptor and the Rainbow Gun. I'll start out with the Scourge of Corruptor, and it's pretty good, especially the small homing projectiles after you hit an enemy. And if you're on a corruption world, since you can't get vampire knives, it's a decent replacement. Plus, you can get dark souls while farming for this weapon. And there isn't that much to say about this weapon. Overall, the Scourge of the Corruptor is all around just a solid weapon that can compete with many melee weapons at the same stage of the game. Next in this tier is the Rainbow Gun, which is an amazing support weapon, one of the best in the game, and works really well in any class as a support weapon in combination with sentries or summons. The multi-target damage is insane, as we saw earlier during the damage per second part, but this is not a main weapon. As you saw in the boss fight section, this is not meant to be a good damage dealer, just add a little bit of DPS to any class, and it's also great for mob farming due to its piercing ability. And one of my favorite features about this is it's in the hollow chest, so you can get this while farming for the Rod of Discord or Souls of Light, so you don't have to go out of your way too much to get this, as many of the other weapons on this list are. Their biomes usually don't have other good drops that you can get while farming for the keys. And finally, in the top tier, we have, of course, the always use it tier, the vampire knives. What do you expect? I think everyone saw this coming. The vampire knives are one of the best main weapons and support weapons in the game, as they can be used with the tank loadout to keep healing up and deal decent damage, or just use as a support for any class you can heal up without having to use potions, as they give potion sickness. And honestly, the biggest downside to this weapon is it can't be obtained in the corruption world. But you can make a crimson world, bring your character to the new world, defeat Plantera, get a crimson key, which is definitely easier said than done, go to your dungeon and get the vampire knives. Then delete the world if you want to, or you can keep it for other exclusive items. An upside to farming, though, is you can collect ichor while farming for these, since ichor stickers spawn the crimson biome as well. Overall, this is one of the best weapons in the game. I would completely recommend farming for it in any playthrough, and even making a crimson world just to go get them. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far in the video, I'm guessing you liked what you saw, and I have a bunch of other videos like this, and my goal for the end of the year is to be monetized. But to get that, I need 1,000 subscribers, which we're almost halfway there, and then something called 4,000 watch hours, which basically, if you watch this video for 10 minutes, that's 10 minutes of watch time, but I need 4,000. So by watching this, you're supporting me, but the next best way you can support, if you already watched the video, is to like, subscribe, and comment your opinion down below. Plus, once I hit 500 subscribers, I'll have a new series that you, the viewers, can participate in, which is a March Madness style bracket of a bunch of pre-hard mode weapons that you guys can vote for. But right now, even though I haven't hit 500 subscribers, I'm trying to get it down from 32 to 16 different weapons. And there's only a few days left in the polls. So you can go vote right now on my community page for which weapon should move on to the actual event. The top left is what YouTube thinks you want to watch next. The bottom left is underrated and overrated Terraria items and weapons. The bottom right are reviewing weapons and comparing them. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe so I can hit 500 subscribers to get my new series out soon.